On Catherine the Great. We again see a continuation of westernization through Catherine the Great's rule, just in the sense that, first off, she wasn't even Russian to begin with. Catherine the Great was German-born. She was also Protestant. And the reason why she arrived in Russia was as a bride to Peter III, who at that point was the Tsar of Russia. But in 1762, Peter III dies. There are many historical conspiracy theories that argue that Catherine actually was somehow involved in his death. But nonetheless, we will see that Catherine will turn into the next Tsar of Russia in the wake of her husband's death. We do see that Catherine definitely makes efforts to legitimize her rule by learning Russian traditions. So she joins the Orthodox Church, which again shows us how Russians are still legitimizing their power through union with the Church. So despite Peter's reforms with the Church, it was still very important for the Tsar to establish a connection with it. We do see that Catherine, her influence from the Enlightenment was apparent in virtually every decision she ever made. She corresponded with Western European thinkers, and they were called, the Enlightenment thinkers were called philosophes, a French word for philosopher. So one prominent example was her relationship with Voltaire. At first she became pen pals with him, and then eventually she invited him to join her court. And so by having French Enlightenment philosophes actually directly living in Russia, she had access to Enlightenment ideals on a constant basis. She also was influenced by some of Voltaire's opinions on the criminal justice system by her efforts to try to codify Russian laws, and in particular, she tries to end practices of torture, which was very much an idea that was tied to the Enlightenment. It's not surprising that boyars were very resistant to her reforms. Again, as absolutism consolidates, that means that it's really going to be at the boyars' expense. So Catherine is still interested in maintaining a positive relationship with the boyars because there is a constant fear that the peasants will revolt. And so we do see that because the boyars are resistant to some of Catherine's reforms, that she does try to give in to some important revisions of the law to make sure that the boyars still remain supportive of Catherine. So, for example, in 1785, Catherine exempts the boyars from paying taxes. And she also exempts them from performing the state service that had been required ever since Peter the Great's reign. So again, this sort of preferential treatment to the boyars is one way that Catherine tries to maintain a positive relationship with them. Another thing that we see is that there were numerous peasant revolts that ultimately fail. Pugachev's revolt is one of the best examples of that, which we will talk about in more detail in a moment. But what we see is that after these peasant revolts, Catherine actually allows landowners, boyars, to exert more control over the movement of serfs. So in the early years of Catherine's reign, she seemed to be more forgiving to peasants, and because there were these numerous attempts at peasant revolts, Catherine actually is going to be much more strict with the way that peasants are controlled, and so that's one limit to the way that the Enlightenment influences her rule. Just like Peter the Great, we will see that there is going to be some significant territorial expansion when Catherine is ruling. Essentially, we see, and this is sort of a small map, but Catherine the Great ruled until 1796. So that means that everything that is represented in this dark orange represents areas that were added to Russia's land under Catherine the Great's reign. So most importantly, I want you to pay attention to the lands north of the Black Sea. She annexes the Crimean Peninsula. She also annexes land that connects the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. So this is going to give Russia some pretty important trade connections with Europe as well as with the Middle East. And so that's a huge development. But because of Catherine the Great's expansions, and of course the expansions of Peter before her, Russia now is certainly considered to be a very significant Eurasian land empire. And I'll send you some notes that include a chart that actually shows you some of the most significant empires that exist in Eurasia, with Russia included in that chart. The really important land that she gains here is from Turkey. So she gains this land in the Russo-Turkish wars, which take place in the 1760s as well as the 1780s. Also, she does expand a little bit more to the east. So she expands into the steppes of the Ural Mountains. We can see that here. So this plateau area will be gained from Mongolia and it will become part of Russia. And also, again, she gains some land along the Caspian Sea. What these lands do is it allows Russia to create a protective barrier for its agricultural settlements. We will see this land over here to the west. During this time period, Prussia, Austria, and Russia joined forces to partition up Poland. And so basically what we see is these three countries divide Poland amongst themselves. And so these armed lands here to the west represent the portions of Poland that Russia gained control of. What is important is, well, on the one hand, Poland is not going to reappear as an independent country until the 20th century. But one of the problems with this expansion was that it was very expensive. And it also means that Russia is going to get increasingly involved in the political and military struggles over the Ottoman Empire, which at this point is already starting to crumble in the Balkan region. And so, of course, since Russia is so interested in expanding west, this is going to put it into conflict with some other countries in Western Europe. And so we can already see a link between Russia's expansion and ultimately what will break out in World War I in the early 20th century, right? Because, you know, the sort of the interest of so many countries like Russia and Austria, for example, is in gaining control over the Balkan region. Catherine is very successful in terms of, again, expanding the position or elevating the position of women, not at all surprising, of course, because she was a young, educated woman herself. One of the major accomplishments that she does that improves the lives of women is she starts to establish many more schools for young girls. She's also interested in again, bringing more medical technologies and knowledge from Western Europe into Russia. And so she actually encourages Russian people to get smallpox inoculations, which again is a really good example of Westernization from a medical perspective. She certainly continues other Westernization policies that had been begun under Peter the Great. But what's interesting is we do see some pushback, particularly among boyars. And there is this emerging camp of people called Slavophiles, or, you know, the general phenomenon was called Slavophilism. And basically that translates into the love of Slavic culture. And so Slavophiles basically believe that Russia should continue to develop based on its own history and character and not use Western European culture as a model. So we do realize that Westernization is something that is not sort of uniformly supported by the Western population rather. And these men with these long beards are good examples of Slavophiles. Russia, its development at this point is not particularly kind to the Jewish population. So when Poland was added to Russia's territory, this significantly added to the Jewish population in Russia. And this happened in 1795, by the way, the partition of Poland. And so Jews were victims of discrimination in Russia, but at the same time they did fulfill important economic positions in Polish towns and villages. There were Jewish entrepreneurs and artisans in Russia, but they were tied to landed estates, and they were not allowed the same independence that Polish Jews enjoyed. So if you were Jewish and you lived in Russia proper, you experienced some serious discrimination. And so what Catherine did was she tried to establish territory that Jews were required to live in, and that territory was called the Pale of Settlement, which is here. Most of it was formerly Poland, as you can see. And so the Pale, because it is this reserved area for Jews to live in, sets the Jews apart from the rest of the Russian population. It definitely makes them more vulnerable to anti-Semitism. And by the time the 19th century rolls around, we'll see that anti-Jewish attacks are going to be much more prominent. And these events called pogroms would occur, for example, under Alexander III. And pogroms were vicious anti-Jewish attacks. So we do see that anti-Semitism develops even more once we get into the 19th century, and that is sort of started by the blatant segregation of Jews with the Pale of Settlement. Again, the condition of serfdom really does not improve in Russia at all. This is a stark contrast to Europe, where serfdom is going to be eradicated in many Western European countries. During the 14th and 15th century, there are wars in Russia that weaken the central government and increase the power of the nobility. And this is, of course, if the nobility gains power, the serfs are going to suffer. There's going to be an increased demand for grain with the increased population, and so nobles, because they need more agricultural products, are going to impose very harsh conditions on the serfs. Russian serfs, we know, had long suffered very oppressive lives, and this continued before the beginnings of modern Muscovy Russia. Even under the Mongols, they collected heavy tribute and taxes from serfs. And when Russian princes took over from the Mongols, they continued this practice of collecting tributes. They argued that they were collecting tributes to provide protection for serfs, or to support the government's army. But of course, we know that these taxes were very burdensome for them, and it made it very difficult for them to emerge out of the agricultural lifestyle that they'd lived in for so long. So as we said before, despite Peter's attempts to establish a more meritocratic government system, if peasants were paying such heavy head taxes, they were unable to emerge out of their agricultural traditions. So what we really see is that peasants' debts are continuing to increase, and over time peasants are going to lose any land that they were able to achieve, and they were all forced into this permanent system of serfdom. What we see is that serfdom really benefits the government because it kept the peasants under control, and the nobility served to regulate the peasants. And since the peasants continued to be weak, the nobility was more willing to be subservient to the centralized government. Serfdom, of course, benefited the boyars themselves because it provided them with free labor. We also see that local townspeople, so the limited merchant class, they were also controlled and not permitted to move their businesses freely to other cities. So we know that the limited extent of a merchant class that existed in Russia was not sort of free moving like it was in Western Europe. So again, essentially, Russian serfdom is only going to expand as Russia expands geographically. So as Russia expands into the Baltic, to the south and west, and as it expands east into Siberia, serfdom expands along with it because there's this growing agricultural territory. And of course, serfdom is the most economically expedient way to take advantage of that land. So again, Russia remains an agricultural nation, and serfs remained tied to the land long after that practice had ended in Western Europe. So some examples of how serfdom is ending in Western Europe. In England, serfdom actually was abolished by Queen Elizabeth in 1574, so quite early. By contrast, in 1649, there was a law in Russia that actually chained Russian serfs to the land where they were born and ensured their service to landlords who could buy and sell them and administer punishments to them. So again, you have about 75 years after serfdom is actually abolished in England, serfdom actually becomes more tightly enforced in Russia. And then eventually you see the development of communities called mirs, and those are peasant or serf communities, which actually even keeps peasants who are able to buy a little bit of land. They also remain in check by the establishment of these communities directly for peasants. Serfdom does not end in Russia until 1861 under Alexander II with the Emancipation Act, which we will talk about once we get closer to that time. An interesting military development in Russia was the proliferation of a group of people called Cossacks. Cossacks were a warrior class. They were from peasant backgrounds. Many of them actually were runaway serfs who would essentially flee to more outlying areas farther away from major cities. They were skilled fighters, and they tended to live on the grassy steppe areas of Russia, so farther into Siberia, right, areas that were not heavily wooded. Many of them were influenced by the ways of neighboring nomadic descendants of the Mongols. So again, they certainly were not kind of typically Russian in terms of their lifestyle. The Cossack warriors were very fierce. Oftentimes they were directly at odds with the autocratic government of the Tsar. And because they were fiercely independent warriors, sometimes they were actually hired as mercenaries to try to defend Russia against the outside invaders. For example, the Swedish, the Tatars from Crimea, or the Ottomans. So the Cossacks, even though sometimes they were at odds with the Russian government, they were very important in terms of helping Russia expand east into the Ural Mountains and even farther east into Siberia. As I said earlier, Catherine's rule does experience some serious tension with Cossacks as well as peasants, and one of the most prominent examples of that was the 1774 rebellion led by Pugachev, who was a Cossack who actually claimed to be Catherine's murdered husband, Peter III. So basically, he was disgruntled with Catherine's rule, and by claiming to be Peter III, he was attempting to, establish supremacy over Catherine. And so Pugachev gains a following of a whole bunch of people that are also disgruntled with Catherine's rule. So he gathers together discontented peasants, minority ethnicity groups, and other Cossacks. And they are quite successful for around a year or so. They start to control territory along the Volga River and the Ural Mountains. But after about a year, Pugachev is going to be captured, and he's going to be brutally executed in Moscow. He is beheaded and then quartered, which serves an example to other Cossacks and peasants about what can happen if they try to challenge the authority of the Tsar. And what we see also is with Pugachev's rebellion, any attempt for Catherine to be more forgiving towards the serfs in terms of her social policies is essentially going to go away. So as we know, Catherine was influenced by the Enlightenment, and she tried to do things like abolish torture. And she at least entertained the idea of freeing the serfs. But after Pugachev's rebellion, any kind of lax policies towards the serfs would definitely go away. And finally, we want to bring it back to a comparison with Western Europe. So we want to think about how absolutism in Russia was both similar and different from absolutism in, say, France, which is kind of a classic example of absolutism in Russia. So similarities. Both Russia and France were certainly ruled by very well-known and established leaders. So examples of that, of course, would be the sort of epitome of absolutism in France, which was Louis XIV, the Sun King. And Peter the Great is an excellent example of a well-known ruler in Russia, but I would argue you could certainly add Catherine the Great to that list. Neither France nor Russia had an effective legislative body, which again is one of the reasons why they truly are absolutist. The monarch is in control. There's no sort of Congress or any kind of lawmaking body that exists in tandem with the monarch. In France, as we know from our study of the French Revolution last year, there was a body called the Estates General, but it did not meet at all between 1614 and 1789. So, there was the potential to have a legislative body, but since it did not meet, there was no representation in any classes besides the monarch and their administration itself. In Russia, there was no legislative body whatsoever. In the days before Catherine the Great, Tsarina Elizabeth actually ruled directly by decree, and she obtained advice from appointed advisors. So again, since there's no legislative body that exists whatsoever in Russia, that certainly allows absolutism to proliferate. Another similarity between Russia and France is that there was serious ambition among the rulers to expand their territory. We see arguably that Russia was actually more successful in terms of expanding because they expand so far east into Siberia and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But France, even if it did not expand as much, we know that they had aspirations to expand. And one of the best examples of that was its involvement in the 7 Years' War, where, again, France was largely unsuccessful. They actually lost a very significant amount of land in North America. Russia also was involved in the 7 Years' War, and the result of both countries' involvements in that war was that they both experienced some pretty significant financial burdens. There are, though, differences that exist between Russia and France in terms of absolutism that are important to acknowledge. And so even though Russia had some influence from Enlightenment ideals, it obviously was not to the same degree. Enlightenment ideals really only had a major effect on the upper classes, whereas you could argue that the Enlightenment actually had a greater effect on all classes in France. Of course, the Enlightenment ultimately, one could say, is one of the reasons why the French Revolution was inspired, which did have a significant peasant involvement, at least in the early stages. Whereas, there's very little change in lifestyle that the Enlightenment actually institutes among the peasant classes in Russia. The other major difference we know is that Russia did not experience a major rebirth or a major religious upheaval, so it did not have a Renaissance, so to speak, and it also did not have a Reformation. And another difference is that serfdom lasts much longer in Russia. We know serfdom ends in France during the French Revolution, so in 1789 serfdom effectively is over in France. But serfdom does not end in Russia until 1861, so that's a major difference, just that serfdom lasts that much longer. And the other major difference is that in terms of an actual political revolution against absolutism, absolutism lasts much longer in Russia, right? The French Revolution begins in 1789, and although it's limited, we know that Napoleon returns to be essentially an absolutist ruler. By 1848, again, there is an attempt at revolution, and you do establish after that time a republican government in France that has a a stronger legislative body. Whereas in Russia, you don't have any sort of political revolution against the absolute monarchy until 1918 with the Russian Revolution. So that's a major difference, just in the sense that absolutism lasts so much longer in Russia. So Russia is a very good example of absolutism, but we have to consider it as a unique example of absolutism because Russia, in many ways, is not European. But then we see certainly its European influences and other elements. And so that is our review on absolutism. We are going to keep going and talk about the gunpowder ages and the Islamic empires next. So I know we went through this quite quickly, but the idea is that we already covered this material quite extensively in AP Euro last year. So we want to talk about topics that we have not yet discussed by moving back to non-Western subjects. So I hope you get home safely with this early dismissal, and I will see you in class on Thursday.